We thought we were gods. We thought we could bend reality to our will, peel back the layers of existence and peer into the unknown. And for a while it seemed like we could. But what we didn't realize, what we refused to believe, was that something might be staring back. I work for a government facility so classified that even speaking about it out loud outside the walls is a criminal offense. Buried miles underground, hidden beneath layers of reinforced steel and technology that doesn't officially exist, we were tasked with one job: pushing the boundaries of physics beyond what the human mind could comprehend. Not for warfare, not for the betterment of mankind, just because we could. And we did. I was there when it happened. I was in the room when we tore open the fabric of reality itself, when we reached into a place no human was ever meant to go, and I was there when something on the other side reached back. The lab is officially called Site 17, though among the team we call it the Pit. It's buried so deep underground that there are no windows, no cell service, no connection to the outside world. Once you're in, you're in. No social media, no family visits, no stepping out for some air. You sign your life away the moment you walk through those doors. And for what? For the pursuit of knowledge, for the kind of science that would never see the light of day in the public sphere. My clearance level was high, but even I only understood fragments of what we were doing. We weren't just dealing with theoretical physics. We were testing them, bending them, breaking them. The team I worked with, we were the best in the world. People who had solved equations that had no solution. People who had rewritten the rules of space-time on paper and then built machines to prove them. And for months, we had been working on something we called Project Gateway. The idea was simple in theory: create a controlled tear in space-time, a door to somewhere else. The higher-ups never told us why. That's how these places work. You don't ask questions, you do the job. But we all knew the implications. A doorway to another place meant access to new resources, new dimensions, new possibilities, or maybe, just maybe, a glimpse into what comes after death. The first few attempts were failures. Our instruments could detect subtle disturbances, tiny fractures in reality itself, but nothing stable, nothing tangible. But then, something changed. We ran the experiment on a Friday night. Most of the facility was empty, aside from essential personnel. The plan was to generate a micro-stable rift, something no larger than a grain of sand, just long enough to observe and analyze. We had everything calculated, every safety measure in place, but the moment we activated the device, we knew something was wrong. The usual hum of machinery, consistent, almost comforting, turned into something else, a low, guttural vibration that made my bones ache. The lights flickered, the air itself seemed to thicken, and for the first time in my entire career, I felt something that science couldn't explain. A presence. Then, the rift opened, not a tiny pinprick, not a controlled fragment, a gaping wound in reality, stretching across the center of the lab, and something was moving on the other side. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It wasn't something I could immediately place, rotten, but not organic. Not decay in the way a body rots, but something worse. Like the air itself had soured, like it had been left to stagnate for 1,000 years. A wave of nausea rolled through me, and I wasn't the only one. Around the room I saw my colleagues gagging, some doubling over, hands over their mouths. But none of us moved away. We couldn't. Because the thing in front of us was unlike anything we had ever seen. The rift wasn't just a tear in space, it was something else entirely. The edges shimmered like liquid glass, but beyond it there was nothing. Not blackness, not a void. Nothing. A kind of absence that my brain struggled to process, like looking into a space that shouldn't exist. The machines around us were screaming, alarms blaring, monitors flashing unreadable data. The power levels were fluctuating wildly, but the rift remained open, impossibly stable. And then the movement started again. It wasn't immediate. At first I thought it was just a trick of the eyes, shadows shifting at the edges like ripples on water, But then they began to take shape, hands. Or at least that's what they looked like, not flesh and bone, but something thinner, stretched like strands of sinew. They didn't move like human hands either. There was an unnatural fluidity to them, like they were unbound by the limitations of muscle and joint. The worst part, they weren't reaching in. They were pulling something out. A shape began to emerge from the void, slow, deliberate. At first, it was impossible to tell what it was. It had no clear form, no distinct features, just an amorphous mass that shifted and pulsed as it crossed into our world. And then, as if deciding to solidify, it took shape. It looked human. That was the first deception. It had the vague outline of a person, arms, legs, a head. But the proportions were off, too tall, too thin, and its face. I still have nightmares about that face. It was like someone had taken the concept of a human and tried to recreate it from memory, but they got the details wrong. The eyes were just slightly too far apart. The mouth stretched just a little too wide, and the skin, if it even was skin, was translucent, shifting in and out of focus like it wasn't fully here. It took a single step forward, and the temperature in the room plummeted. "Shut it down!" Dr. Patel's voice cut through the chaos, sharp with panic. He was one of the lead researchers, the kind of guy who never showed fear. But right then, I could hear it. "We can't!" someone else shouted. "The controls are unresponsive." I turned to the main console, expecting to see flashing red warnings, errors, something. But the screen was worse than that. It wasn't showing anything at all, just a single line of text, repeating over and over. "It sees you." That was the moment the lights went out, and the screaming started. The emergency lights flickered on, washing everything in a deep red glow. It didn't help. If anything, it made it worse. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. The figure, if I could even call it that, was standing completely still. It hadn't moved from where it had stepped through the rift. But that didn't bring me any relief, because now that the main lights were out, I could see it more clearly. It wasn't solid. Not entirely. Parts of it flickered like an image struggling to stay in focus. One moment its limbs were long and spindly, the next, they were short and malformed. Its head tilted slightly as if it were listening, or maybe sensing. And then it twitched. Not a natural movement, not a shift of weight or a slow step forward. It was instant. 1 second it was standing near the rift, the next it was a foot closer. No in between, no motion, just there. That was when the first person died. Dr. Hughes, one of the physicists. He was standing closest to the rift, frantically typing into a terminal, trying to override the shutdown failure. 1 second, he was there. The next, he was gone. I didn't see it happen, none of us did. There was no sound, no struggle, no movement, just an absence. One blink and he was missing. His chair was still spinning, his clipboard was still clattering to the floor. But he was gone. The panic broke then. People scrambled away from their stations, tripping over cables, pushing each other in desperation to get to the exit. But I was frozen, my eyes locked on the thing standing in the room with us. It had moved again. Closer. And this time it was facing me. The face shifted, parts of it warping in and out of recognition. And then it opened its mouth. I don't know if I can even call it a mouth. It was a hole, stretching from where its chin should have been all the way up to where the nose should start. Deep, black, an absence of form. And when it opened, I heard myself, not screaming, not breathing, speaking, a perfect echo of my own voice. "Help me." My own words, repeated back to me in the exact tone I had used moments before when I first saw the rift open. It wasn't guessing, it wasn't mimicking speech randomly, it was remembering. And then without warning it snapped its head to the left, toward Dr. Patel, who was still shouting for someone to shut the damn rift down. Another flicker, and then Patel was gone. No sound, no warning. Just empty space where a man had been standing. I don't remember deciding to run. I just remember moving. I turned and bolted toward the exit with the others, my mind a haze of pure animal terror. The klaxons were screaming in my ears, the emergency lights flashing like a heartbeat. I reached the door, slammed my palm against the security pad. Access denied. That was impossible. The facility had emergency fail-safes. In a critical event, all doors were supposed to open, allowing personnel to evacuate. The system never locked down unless something inside was classified as a containment breach. We weren't locked in, we were being kept in. I turned back just in time to see 3 more people vanish. No struggle, no sound, just gone. And the thing? It was closer again. It wasn't moving like a living thing. It was jumping between moments, existing in one space and then another without crossing the distance in between. I felt something cold crawl up my spine. This thing wasn't just in our world. It was outside of time itself, and it was learning. The room was in chaos. People were pounding on the locked exit, screaming into dead comms, scrambling toward terminals that refused to respond. But none of that mattered, because the thing was still there, and it was watching us. I kept my back pressed against the steel door, my mind racing for a solution. But how the hell do you fight something that doesn't move the way it should? Something that doesn't just kill, but erases? Then the alarms cut out. Just like that. Dead silence. No droning sirens, no flashing red lights, just the hum of the rift behind us and the quiet, shuddering breaths of the few of us who were still alive. And then I heard it. A whisper. Not from the thing, but from the walls. It started as a faint crackling sound like radio static bleeding through the air itself. Then it became something else, something worse. Voices, familiar voices, my own voice, Patel's voice, Hugh's voice. I don't know how, but I knew it wasn't an echo. It wasn't some kind of sound loop bouncing through the facility's audio system. It was them, the ones who had vanished. They were somewhere else now. And then I heard my own voice again. But this time, it was coming from the thing. It had turned toward me, its head tilting in that unnatural, jerky motion. The shifting features of its face settled for a moment, and then, clear as day, it spoke. In my voice. I remember you. Every hair on my body stood up. It had seen me. It had memorized me. It wasn't just watching, it was collecting. And before I could even process what was happening, it twitched again. And suddenly, it wasn't alone. The rift behind it had begun pulling itself wider. Not just a tear now, but a gaping wound in reality itself. And from that nothingness, from that impossible absence of space, more of them stepped through. Not identical, not clones, but variations. Some taller, some smaller, some hunched over on twisted, malformed limbs. All of them with those flickering, unfinished faces, shifting as if they hadn't quite decided what they should look like. And every single one of them turned to look at us. The air changed then. It was subtle at first, an almost imperceptible pressure, like the atmosphere itself was getting heavier. But then I felt it. The pull. Not physical, not like gravity. Like something inside of me was being drawn toward the rift. It wasn't just erasing people, it was absorbing them. And we were next. The pull was getting stronger. I could feel it deep in my chest, like something inside of me, something fundamental was being unraveled, thread by thread. It wasn't just dragging us toward the rift, it was peeling us away from reality itself. I saw the others fighting against it. Some were gripping onto desks, others clawing at the floor. But it didn't matter. Their fingers scraped against steel, against polished concrete, but there was nothing to hold on to. I turned back toward the rift, toward the things that had stepped through. There were more now. Too many. They weren't moving. Not yet. They just stood there, shifting, flickering, their faces stretching and collapsing like they were trying to settle on the right shape, but their mouths, Their mouths were all open. And the whispering, Jesus Christ, the whispering was growing louder. More voices. More familiar voices. Somewhere in that tangled, overlapping murmur, I heard my mother's voice, and she was calling my name. I snapped my head away, squeezing my eyes shut. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. My mother was alive. She was safe. She wasn't in some hellish dimension beyond the rift. But my body didn't care about logic. Every instinct was screaming at me to run to her. My legs almost obeyed. Almost. Then one of the scientists, a guy named Ramirez, gave in. I didn't see his expression, didn't hear if he said anything. I just saw him let go, and then he was gone. Not pulled, not yanked through the rift. He folded out of existence, like a piece of paper crushed into nothing. No scream, no blood, just gone. And the things, they were watching, they were waiting. They weren't just consuming us. They were studying us, testing us, seeing who would break first. I felt my mind fracturing. It wasn't just the fear. It was something deeper, something I couldn't explain. The longer I looked at the rift, the more I felt like I wasn't supposed to. Like my brain wasn't designed to process it. It wasn't just a hole in space. It was wrong. Like it had always been there. Like it had been waiting. The whispering had changed now. It wasn't just voices. It was words. I could hear my name, over and over. I could hear pieces of conversations I'd had years ago, things I'd forgotten until this moment. It was inside my head. And I wasn't the only one. A woman, Dr. Evans, was whispering to herself, shaking violently, her fingernails digging into her own arms. Tears were streaming down her face. Then she looked at me, and she spoke in my voice, not her voice, mine. I don't belong here. It took me a second to realize what had just happened. The thing, the first one, was still staring at me. It had said that to me earlier. I hadn't spoken those words out loud. I had only thought them. And now Evans was repeating them. She took a step forward. "Evans," I said, my voice shaking. "Stay back." She didn't even blink. She just took another step, and another, until she was standing directly in front of the thing. It didn't move. It didn't react. It just watched her. Then she whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "I remember you." The exact same words it had said to me. And then she was gone. Not folded, not pulled. She became one of them. Her body flickered, twisting, stretching, shifting out of sync with the world. Her face blurred. Then she was standing among them. Her mouth hung open, but she wasn't screaming. She was whispering, the same voices, the same words. It wasn't killing us. It was turning us into them. I couldn't breathe. My mind refused to accept what I had just seen. 1 second, Evans had been herself, a person I'd worked with, talked to, laughed with. And then, in the space of a heartbeat, she was one of them. No transition, no struggle. Just gone. The whispering was louder now. The things were shifting, their limbs twisting into new shapes as if adapting. They had no eyes, but I knew they were looking at me, at all of us. Then, from behind me, bang! A gunshot. Someone had drawn their sidearm. I turned just in time to see another scientist, McKay, standing near a console, his hands shaking, his face drenched in sweat. He fired again, the muzzle flash lighting up the darkened lab. The bullet hit one of the things directly in the chest, and passed straight through. No impact. No reaction. Like it wasn't even there. McKay's breathing was ragged. His hand trembled as he took a step back. No. 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 Then, without warning, his expression changed. His panic vanished. His face went completely slack, and slowly he turned his head toward me. "I see you." I felt ice crawl up my spine. That wasn't McKay's voice. It was mine, perfectly replicated. The same tone, the same inflection. McKay's mouth twitched. His hands dropped to his sides, and then he took a step toward the rift. "McKay!" I shouted, but he didn't stop. He walked, calm, unblinking, straight toward the gaping wound in reality. The other scientists were screaming, reaching for him, but they couldn't move fast enough. I could. I lunged. I grabbed his arm and yanked him back. And for half a second I felt something else pulling him forward, something I couldn't see. It was like grabbing a drowning man, but instead of water, there was only air. McKay's face twisted, not in pain, not in struggle, but in understanding. His eyes locked onto mine, and then he spoke in my mother's voice. "You have to let go." I did. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to. But my fingers opened on their own, and McKay took his final step forward. The moment he touched the rift, he shattered, not into pieces, not into blood and bone, into words. 1,000 whispers exploded through the lab, overlapping, deafening. McKay's entire existence dissolved into language, his voice breaking apart, scattered into a chorus of voices that didn't belong to him, and then he was part of them, one more whisper in the storm. I stumbled back, my legs barely holding me up. My hands were shaking. My skin felt wrong, like something had touched me, something I couldn't see, something still lingering. McKay was gone, not dead, not erased, just absorbed. His whispers joined the others, blending into that endless overlapping chorus. And as they grew louder, the things began to shift again. Their forms became clearer, more defined. Their faces almost looked human now, because they were becoming us. They weren't just studying, they were replacing. A scream broke through the noise. I turned just in time to see another scientist, Roswell, collapse to her knees. She clutched her head, nails digging into her scalp, her mouth opening in a silent wail. And then, without warning, she spoke in two voices at once. One was her own, the other was McKay's. It was coming from inside her, like he was trying to claw his way back out. The rift wasn't just pulling us in, it was keeping us somewhere else, and we were still aware, still conscious. Roswell screamed again, her back arching as if something was yanking at her spine. And then she flickered, not like the things, like a TV losing signal. 1 second she was solid, real, flesh and blood. The next, she wasn't there at all. Just a faint afterimage, like a shadow burned into the air. I saw her eyes, wide with terror, as she tried to mouth something, but there was no sound. Then she blinked out, and she never came back. I felt something inside me break. This wasn't just a containment failure. This wasn't a breach. This was a replacement, and we weren't going to make it out alive, unless... I turned to the console. The main controls were still unresponsive. The emergency override was offline. The system refused to shut the rift down, but there was one last fail-safe, a manual kill switch. Buried deep beneath the lab, beneath layers of reinforced steel, was a reactor core. If we overloaded it, we could destroy the entire site, and if we were lucky, bury the rift with it. I made my decision. We're blowing the facility. The remaining scientists turned to me, eyes wide, faces pale. No one argued because they knew it was the only way.
No one hesitated. The ones who were still alive, still human, understood what had to be done. There was no other way. If we didn't destroy the facility, it wouldn't just be us who were lost. It would be the world. I sprinted to the emergency panel, slamming my hand onto the biometric scanner. A single prompt flashed on the screen. Manual reactor overload. Confirm. The countdown would give us exactly 5 minutes before the entire facility collapsed in on itself, taking the rift, and whatever had come through it, with it. My throat was dry. My fingers hovered over the confirmation key. This was it. Then I heard my own voice whisper right behind me. Stop. I froze. I turned my head, slow, hesitant, like my body knew it didn't want to see what was behind me. There I was, or something that looked like me. It wasn't a perfect copy. Its face flickered in and out of focus, shifting like the others, but its eyes, my eyes, were locked onto mine, and it was smiling. A wide, stretching, unnatural smile. Then it spoke again. "You don't have to do this." Its voice was wrong. It was too close to mine, too precise. Not just mimicking, not just copying. It remembered me. It knew me. The others backed away from it, but I couldn't move. I was staring at my own face, my own reflection, twisted into something else, and it was still smiling. "Let me show you what's on the other side." I knew what it was trying to do. It wasn't trying to stop me. It was trying to convince me. Because that's what it did. It didn't need force. It didn't need violence. It only needed a voice. It only needed a thought. And if I listened too long, if I let that thought take root, I'd be one of them. So I didn't listen. I slammed my fist onto the confirmation key. The system beeped. Reactor overload initiated. 5 minutes until detonation. The lights flashed red. The entire facility shook, deep tremors rippling through the floors as the failsafe sequence began. The thing that wore my face didn't stop smiling. It just tilted its head, curious, and then it flickered. Not forward, not closer, behind me. A hand, my own hand, closed around my wrist and pulled. I had never felt anything like it before. It wasn't a grip. It wasn't pressure. It was a void. Like my wrist had been submerged in something that didn't exist, something that wasn't meant to exist. My vision blurred. My body screamed to pull away, but my limbs wouldn't respond. The thing that wore my face leaned in, its mouth too wide, its eyes too empty. And then it spoke in my thoughts, not out loud, not in sound, inside my head. "You belong with us." I yanked my arm back with everything I had. The moment my skin tore free from its grasp, my body snapped back into reality, like I'd been held underwater and finally broke the surface. I stumbled, my breath ragged, my heart slamming against my ribs. My hand, where it had touched me, was ice cold. The skin was pale, almost colorless. I couldn't feel my fingers, but I didn't have time to think about it. The countdown was at 4 minutes. "Move! Go!" I shouted. The survivors ran. We sprinted through the corridors, past empty rooms, past bloodstains where people used to be. I could still hear the whispers, still feel them in the walls, in the air, in my bones. And I knew they weren't trying to stop us. Because they weren't afraid of dying. They didn't die. They just became something else. We reached the last security checkpoint. The blast doors were already halfway sealed, protocol to contain the explosion. There was barely enough space to slip through. One by one, the survivors dove underneath the closing steel slab. I was the last one. And just as I reached the threshold, I heard my own voice, right in my ear. "It's not over." I threw myself forward. The doors slammed shut behind me. A second later, the world collapsed, a roar of metal and flame. The ground gave out beneath us. The pressure wave ripped through the tunnel. I felt myself lifted, tossed like a rag doll, debris slicing past my face, my arms, and then silence. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, I was on the surface. The facility was gone. Nothing left but a crater. No sign of the rift, no sign of them. But I knew. They weren't destroyed. Not completely. Because as I lay there staring up at the sky, trying to convince myself that we had won, I heard something. A whisper. Not from below. Not from around me. From inside my own head, and it said, "I remember you.